The morning sun barely touched the horizon when Sarah Martinez adjusted her medical pack for the third time. At 26, she had already served 2 tours overseas, but today felt different. The weight of her gear seemed heavier, and the nervous energy among the soldiers around her was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Hey, Doc," called out Sergeant Williams, using the nickname everyone had given her despite her protests that she wasn't actually a doctor. "You ready for another fun day in paradise?" Sarah managed to smile, though her stomach churned with anxiety. She had joined the Army as a medic 3 years ago, driven by a desire to help people and serve her country. What she hadn't expected was the constant battle to prove herself worthy of respect. To most of the soldiers in her unit, she was just another field medic, someone who patched up scrapes and handed out aspirin. The briefing had been straightforward enough. Their convoy would escort supplies to a forward operating base about 50 miles north. Intelligence suggested minimal threat levels, which should have been reassuring. Instead, Sarah found herself checking her medical supplies obsessively, running through trauma procedures in her mind. "Martinez!" Colonel Thompson's voice cut through her thoughts. At 45, the colonel was a career soldier who commanded respect through presence alone. His weathered face showed the strain of countless missions, and his eyes held the weight of decisions that kept hundreds of soldiers alive. "Yes, sir," Sarah responded, snapping to attention. "You'll be riding in the 3rd vehicle. Keep your eyes open and your gear ready. We got 200 good soldiers counting on this mission going smoothly." As Sarah climbed into the armored vehicle, she noticed the skeptical looks from some of the older soldiers. Private Johnson, a 20-year veteran, shook his head slightly as he checked his rifle. "Great, we got the rookie medic," he muttered to his buddy, loud enough for Sarah to hear. The comment stung, but Sarah had learned to keep her emotions in check. She had graduated top of her class from medical training, spent countless hours studying trauma medicine, and had successfully treated dozens of wounded soldiers in her previous deployments. Yet somehow, she always felt like she had to prove herself all over again with each new assignment. The convoy rolled out just after dawn, a line of armored vehicles cutting through the dusty landscape. Sarah watched the terrain through the small window, noting potential landing zones for medical helicopters and escape routes, habits drilled into her during training. The countryside looked deceptively peaceful, with small villages dotting the horizon and farmers working their fields. 2 hours into the journey, the radio crackled with routine check-ins from each vehicle. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Sarah allowed herself to relax slightly, reviewing her mental checklist of medical procedures. She had organized her supplies the night before: trauma bandages, morphine, saline bags, and emergency surgery tools, all within easy reach. "So, Martinez," said Corporal Davis, breaking the silence in their vehicle, "how many real trauma cases you handled? And I don't mean training dummies." "Enough," Sarah replied simply, not wanting to get drawn into another conversation about her qualifications. The truth was, she had treated gunshot wounds, blast injuries, and severe trauma during her previous tours. But she had learned that listing her experiences often came across as defensive or boastful. The landscape began to change as they moved deeper into hostile territory. Rocky outcroppings provided perfect cover for ambushes, and Sarah found herself tensing with each blind corner. Her hands unconsciously moved to her medical pack, ensuring everything was secure and accessible. "Contact front." The radio suddenly exploded with urgent voices. "IED! IED! Vehicle 1 is down." The convoy screeched to a halt as the lead vehicle disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris. Sarah's training kicked in immediately, and she was grabbing her gear before their vehicle had completely stopped. "Martinez, stay put," ordered Sergeant Williams. "We need to assess the situation first." But Sarah was already moving. Through the chaos and shouting, she could hear the unmistakable sounds of wounded soldiers calling for help. Her medical training overrode everything else, and she knew that every second counted in trauma situations. The scene that greeted her was worse than anything she had encountered before. The The lead vehicle was twisted metal, smoke pouring from its engine. 3 soldiers lay motionless nearby, while 2 others writhed in pain from obvious injuries. Blood stained the dusty ground, and the acrid smell of explosives filled the air. "We need a medic," someone screamed, but Sarah was already running toward the casualties. Her medical pack bounced against her back as she covered the 50 yards in what felt like slow motion. Behind her, she could hear Sergeant Williams shouting orders, but the words seemed distant and muffled. The first soldier she reached was unconscious but breathing. A quick assessment revealed a probable concussion and possible internal injuries. The second soldier was conscious but had severe lacerations on his arms and face. The third soldier, Private Chun, barely 19 years old, was in the worst condition. A piece of shrapnel had penetrated his abdomen, and blood was seeping through his uniform at an alarming rate. "I need saline and pressure bandages now," Sarah called out, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. Her hands worked automatically, applying direct pressure to Chen's wound while simultaneously checking his pulse and breathing. As she worked, Sarah became aware of additional explosions in the distance. The initial IED had been just the beginning. Through the smoke and confusion, she could see muzzle flashes from the rocky outcroppings ahead. The convoy had driven straight into a coordinated ambush. "Incoming fire!" someone shouted. Bullets began pinging off the armored vehicles, forcing soldiers to take cover. But Sarah couldn't move. Chen's life depended on constant pressure being applied to his wound, and moving him without proper stabilization would likely kill him. "Martinez, get down." Colonel Thompson appeared beside her, his rifle ready. His uniform was torn, and blood trickled from a cut on his forehead. "We need to move these casualties to cover." "I can't move him yet, sir," Sarah replied, her hands never leaving Chen's wound. "He'll bleed out if I stop applying pressure. Give me 2 minutes to get him stabilized." Colonel Thompson looked at the young medic with new eyes. While experienced soldiers were diving for cover, this supposedly rookie medic was calmly performing life-saving procedures under direct enemy fire. Her hands were steady, her voice was calm, and her focus was absolute. "Johnson, Williams, provide covering fire," the colonel ordered. "Let the medic work." As bullets whistled overhead, Sarah continued her work. She had trained for situations like this, but training could never fully prepare someone for the reality of treating critical injuries while under attack. Chen's pulse was weak, but steady. She managed to get him force-started, pushing fluids to combat shock while maintaining pressure on his abdominal wound. "How's he looking, Doc?" Colonel Thompson asked, using the nickname Sarah had always protested. "He's stable for now, but he needs surgery within the hour," Sarah replied. "The shrapnel missed his major organs, but there's significant blood loss. I can keep him alive, but we need to get him evacuated." The firefight continued around them, but something had changed. The soldiers who had been skeptical about their rookie medic were now watching her with growing respect. Here was someone who didn't just talk about courage. She demonstrated it through action. As Sarah worked to stabilize the second casualty, she noticed Colonel Thompson struggling to maintain his position. The cut on his forehead was worse than she had initially thought, and he was showing signs of a concussion. But he continued directing the defense, ensuring his soldiers maintained their positions while the medic did her work. "Sir," Sarah called out during a brief lull in the firing, "you need to let me check that head wound." "I'm fine, Martinez," the colonel replied, though his words were slightly slurred. "Focus on the serious casualties." Sarah recognized the signs of traumatic brain injury, but she also knew better than to argue with a commanding officer in the middle of a firefight. Instead, she made a mental note to keep watching the colonel for deteriorating symptoms. The ambush seemed to last forever, but military records would later show it lasted exactly 43 minutes. When the firing finally stopped, Sarah had successfully stabilized 3 critical casualties and treated minor injuries on 7 others. Her uniform was soaked with blood, none of it her own, and her hands shook slightly from exhaustion and adrenaline. "Outstanding work, Martinez," Colonel Thompson said, though Sarah noticed he swayed slightly as he spoke. "You may have just saved some lives today." As helicopters approached to evacuate the wounded, Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. But she also realized this was just the beginning. The attack had been too coordinated, too well planned to be a random encounter. Intelligence had been wrong about the threat level, which meant there were likely more surprises waiting ahead. Looking at the faces of her fellow soldiers, Sarah saw something different in their expressions. The skepticism was gone, replaced by respect and gratitude. Private Johnson, who had doubted her abilities just hours earlier, nodded at her with what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Not bad for a rookie," he said, and somehow it sounded like the highest compliment she had ever received. But Sarah knew the real test was still to come. As she watched the medical helicopters disappear into the distance, carrying the soldiers she had fought to save, she realized that today had changed something fundamental. She was no longer just trying to prove herself. She had become someone her fellow soldiers could count on when everything went wrong. The convoy reformed, now one vehicle short and carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. As they prepared to continue their mission, Sarah checked her remaining medical supplies and tried not to think about what other challenges the day might bring. She had passed one test, but something told her the hardest trials were still ahead. Colonel Thompson approached her vehicle, moving more slowly than usual. "Good work today, Doc," he said. "I have a feeling we're going to need more of that before this is over." Sarah nodded, noting again the colonel's unsteady gait and the way he seemed to favor his left side. Her medical instincts were telling her something was seriously wrong, but protocol demanded she wait for orders. Still, she made sure her trauma supplies were easily accessible as they prepared to move out again. The convoy rolled forward into an uncertain afternoon, carrying soldiers who had learned valuable lessons about courage, leadership, and the true meaning of service under fire. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as the reduced convoy pushed deeper into hostile territory. Sarah kept glancing toward Colonel Thompson, who rode in the lead vehicle. Even from a distance, she could see he was struggling. His usually perfect posture had given way to an obvious lean, and twice she had watched him grab the vehicle's frame for support. "Something's wrong with the colonel," she muttered to Sergeant Williams, who was monitoring radio communications in their vehicle. "He's been hit harder than he's letting on," Williams agreed. "But you know how he is, mission first, everything else second." Sarah's medical training screamed warnings at her. Head injuries were unpredictable, and the colonel's symptoms were getting worse. A traumatic brain injury could cause sudden collapse, seizures, or worse. In a combat zone, having the commanding officer become incapacitated could mean disaster for everyone. The landscape around them had grown more treacherous. Rocky cliffs rose on both sides of a narrow road, creating perfect ambush positions. Intelligence reports were proving worthless. What should have been a routine supply run was turning into something much more dangerous. "Alpha Base, this is Thunder 6. Colonel Thompson's voice crackled over the radio, though Sarah noticed his usual crisp delivery was slurred. "We've encountered resistance and are proceeding with caution. Estimated arrival time delayed by approximately 2 hours. Copy, Thunder 6. Be advised we have reports of increased enemy activity in your sector. Stay alert and report any further contact immediately." The radio fell silent, leaving only the rumble of engines and the constant scanning of eyes searching for threats. Sarah organized her medical supplies once more, noting that she had already used nearly half her trauma materials on the morning's casualties. If they encountered more wounded soldiers, she would have to make difficult decisions about rationing care. Movement on the ridge line. The spotter's voice cut through the afternoon air. Multiple contacts, approximately 800 meters. Colonel Thompson's voice immediately responded over the radio, but this time his words were definitely slurred, and there was a noticeable delay before he spoke. "All units, maintain spacing watch for." The transmission cut off abruptly. Through her vehicle's periscope, Sarah could see the colonel's figure slumped forward in the lead vehicle. Sergeant Williams was already reaching for the radio when the world exploded around them. The second ambush was far more intense than the first. Enemy fighters had positioned themselves on both sides of the narrow valley, creating a deadly crossfire that trapped the convoy in the open. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked through the air, while automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions. Sarah's vehicle lurched violently as it swerved to avoid an explosion. Through the chaos, she could hear radio voices shouting over each other, trying to coordinate a response. But without clear leadership from the colonel, the convoy's formation was falling apart. Thunder 6, respond immediately. Williams called into his radio, but only static answered. I'm going forward, Sarah announced, grabbing her medical pack. Negative. You stay put until we can secure the area, Williams ordered. But Sarah was already moving. Through the smoke and gunfire, she could see soldiers from the lead vehicle taking cover behind their disabled transport. One figure, unmistakably the colonel based on his height and build, was being dragged to safety by two soldiers. Even from a distance, she could tell he was unconscious. The 50-yard dash to the lead vehicle was the longest of Sarah's life. Bullets snapped past her head, kicking up spurts of dust around her feet. Twice she had to dive for cover behind rocks, her medical pack slamming into her back with each impact. But she kept moving, driven by the knowledge that wounded soldiers needed immediate care. Medic! Medic! The cry came from multiple directions as Sarah reached the lead vehicle. The scene was even worse than the morning's attack. 6 soldiers were down, including Colonel Thompson. Blood pooled in the dust, and the sounds of pain filled the air despite the ongoing gunfight. Sarah's first priority was the colonel. His unconscious state confirmed her worst fears about his head injury from the morning attack. His pulse was weak and irregular, and there were signs of internal bleeding. But as she began her assessment, Corporal Davis grabbed her arm. Doc, we got a man bleeding out over here. Rodriguez took shrapnel to the leg. It's bad. Sarah faced the horrible reality of battlefield medicine. Too many patients, too few resources, and not enough time. She had to make decisions that would determine who lived and who died. The colonel was critically injured, but Rodriguez was in immediate danger of bleeding to death. Apply direct pressure to Rodriguez's wound, she ordered Davis. Use whatever cloth you can find, shirts, bandages, anything. I need 2 minutes with the colonel, then I'll be right there. Working with practiced efficiency, Sarah started in 4 on the unconscious colonel and administered medications to reduce brain swelling. His condition was serious, but he was stable for the moment. Rodriguez, however, was losing blood at a catastrophic rate from a severed artery in his thigh. Move aside, Sarah told Davis, dropping to her knees beside Rodriguez. The 19-year-old soldier was pale and going into shock. Sarah had perhaps 5 minutes to stop the bleeding before he lost consciousness permanently. The wound was worse than she had initially thought. A piece of shrapnel had not only severed the femoral artery, but had also damaged surrounding muscle and tissue. This required immediate surgery, the kind of procedure that should be done in a sterile operating room with a full surgical team, not in the dirt with bullets flying overhead. Rodriguez, stay with me, Sarah said, her voice calm despite the chaos. I'm going to fix this, but I need you to keep talking to me. I can't feel my leg, Doc, Rodriguez whispered, his voice weak. That's okay. I'm going to take care of everything. Sarah's hands worked with incredible precision, applying clamps to control bleeding while simultaneously preparing to repair the damaged artery. She had performed this procedure in training dozens of times, but never under these conditions. Around them, the firefight continued. Sergeant Williams had taken command of the convoy's defense, but without the colonel's experience, their tactical situation was deteriorating. The enemy fighters seemed to know exactly where to position themselves for maximum effect. Johnson, Patterson, we need covering fire on that ridge. Williams shouted into his radio. They're trying to flank us from the east. Sarah blocked out the sounds of combat, focusing entirely on Rodriguez's injury. Using surgical instrument from her pack, she carefully cleaned the wound site and began the delicate process of repairing the artery. Her hands remained steady despite the explosions happening around them. How's he looking, Doc? Asked Private Johnson, who had positioned himself to shield Sarah and her patient from enemy fire. Better, Sarah replied, though she knew Rodriguez was far from stable. I've got the bleeding stopped, but he needs a full surgical team and blood transfusions. How much longer until we can get medical evacuation? That's the problem, Johnson said grimly. With the colonel down and this ambush, we can't call for helicopters until we clear these fighters out. And they seem to know exactly what they're doing. As if to emphasize his point, another rocket-propelled grenade exploded near their position, showering them with rocks and debris. Sarah instinctively covered Rodriguez's exposed wound, protecting it from contamination while continuing her work. I need to check the other casualties, Sarah announced after stabilizing Rodriguez. Keep pressure on this bandage and call me immediately if his pulse weakens. Moving through the combat zone, Sarah treated each wounded soldier with remarkable efficiency. Private Miller had taken bullet fragments to his shoulder and arm, painful but not life-threatening. Specialist Garcia had been knocked unconscious by a blast, but was showing signs of recovery. Corporal Washington had severe burns from an explosion, but was conscious and alert. But it was when Sarah returned to check on Colonel Thompson that she discovered the true extent of their crisis. The colonel was conscious but clearly disoriented, struggling to focus his eyes or speak coherently. The head injury from the morning attack, combined with the stress of the afternoon's ambush, had caused significant brain trauma. "Colonel, can you hear me?" Sarah asked, checking his pupils with a small flashlight. Where are we?" Thompson mumbled, his words badly slurred. "What's happening?" Sarah's heart sank. The colonel had no memory of the current situation and was showing signs of severe cognitive impairment. In a normal medical facility, he would be rushed to emergency surgery. Here, with limited resources and ongoing combat, she could only stabilize his condition and hope for the best. "Sir, you've been injured, but you're going to be okay," Sarah said gently. "I need you to rest while we handle the tactical situation." But even as she spoke, Sarah realized the full weight of their predicament. With the colonel incapacitated, Sergeant Williams was in command, but he was an excellent soldier, not a strategic thinker. The convoy was pinned down by superior numbers in disadvantageous terrain, and their casualties were mounting. "Williams," Sarah called over the radio. "I need to speak with you privately." When the sergeant reached her position, his face was grim with concern. "How bad is the colonel's condition?" "Severe traumatic brain injury," Sarah replied bluntly. "He's conscious but disoriented. He won't be making any tactical decisions for the foreseeable future." Williams absorbed this information with the stoicism of a career soldier. "What about the others?" "Rodriguez is stable but critical. He'll survive if we can get him to a hospital within 6 hours. The others have injuries, but they'll make it. The problem is we've got 8 soldiers who can't fight effectively, including our commanding officer. Around them, the intensity of enemy fire seemed to be increasing. Through the smoke and dust, Sarah could see muzzle flashes from at least a dozen positions. The convoy was clearly outnumbered and outgunned. "What do you recommend, Doc?" Williams asked, and Sarah realized he was asking her opinion not just about medical matters, but about their overall tactical situation. "We can't stay here," Sarah said. "The longer we remain pinned down, the worse our casualties will get. And I'm running low on medical supplies. If we take many more hits, I won't be able to save everyone." Williams nodded grimly. "The problem is moving. With 8 wounded soldiers, including the colonel, we can't move quickly. And those fighters seem to know exactly what they're doing." As if summoned by their conversation, an explosion rocked their position, followed immediately by the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds. The enemy was escalating their attack, clearly intending to finish off the convoy before reinforcements could arrive. "We need to make a decision now," Sarah said urgently. "Either we dig in and try to hold position until help arrives, or we attempt to break out." "But, sir, I have to tell you, the colonel's condition is deteriorating. Without proper medical care soon, he could die." The weight of command had fallen on Sergeant Williams' shoulders at the worst possible moment. 200 soldiers' lives hung in the balance, and the decisions made in the next few minutes would determine whether they lived or died. Sarah checked her watch and her remaining medical supplies. Time was running out for all of them. The mortar rounds were getting closer. Sarah could feel the ground shake with each impact as the enemy fighters adjusted their aim. Through the smoke and chaos, she watched Sergeant Williams struggle with the weight of command that had been thrust upon him. "Williams, we need to move now," Sarah said, checking Colonel Thompson's pulse again. "His brain pressure is increasing. Without surgery in the next few hours, we're going to lose him." "But how?" Williams asked desperately. "We've got 8 wounded soldiers, including 3 who can't walk. The enemy has us pinned from both sides, and we don't have enough healthy soldiers to carry everyone while fighting our way out." Sarah looked around at their dire situation. Rodriguez was unconscious from blood loss despite her emergency surgery. Private Miller's shoulder wound prevented him from carrying a weapon effectively. Corporal Washington's burns made any movement extremely painful. And Colonel Thompson was drifting in and out of consciousness, completely unable to function. "What if we create a diversion?" suggested Private Johnson, who had been listening to their conversation. "Some of us could draw their fire while others evacuate the wounded." "That's a suicide mission," Williams replied flatly. "Those fighters have superior position and numbers. Anyone trying to draw their attention would be cut down in seconds." Another explosion rocked their position, this one close enough to shower them with debris. Sarah instinctively covered her patients, protecting them from falling rocks. As she did, her eyes fell on the rocky terrain around them, and suddenly, an idea began forming. "Sergeant, what if we don't try to fight our way out?" Sarah asked. "What if we find another route?" "Another route? We're trapped in a valley. There's nowhere to go except forward or back, and they've got both directions covered." Sarah pointed to a narrow ravine that cut through the cliff face about 200 meters to their east. "What about that gully? It's steep, but it might lead up and over the ridge. If we could get the wounded soldiers through there, we could bypass the ambush entirely." Williams studied the ravine through binoculars. "It's a hell of a climb, document. And with wounded soldiers." "I can carry them," Sarah interrupted. "You? You're 5'4" and weigh maybe 120 pounds. Rodriguez alone weighs 180. "I've been training for situations like this my entire military career," Sarah said firmly. "I can fireman carry the critically wounded soldiers one at a time. It'll take multiple trips, but it's better than staying here and getting picked off by mortars." Williams looked skeptical. "Even if you could carry them, what about providing security? We need soldiers to protect the evacuation route." "That's where your diversion comes in," Sarah explained. "But instead of a suicide mission, you create the impression that we're preparing for a frontal assault. Draw their attention forward while I evacuate the wounded through the ravine. Once I get them to safety, I can signal for medical helicopters to pick them up from the other side of the ridge." It was a desperate plan, but as another mortar round exploded dangerously close, Williams realized they had few options left. "How long would you need for each trip?" Sarah studied the ravine, calculating distances and obstacles. "Maybe 40 minutes round trip for each wounded soldier. With 8 casualties, that's over 5 hours. But I can take the most critical cases first." "5 hours," Williams muttered. "We don't have enough ammunition to hold this position for 5 hours against that kind of firepower." "Then we need to make them think we're not going anywhere," Sarah said. "Keep returning fire, move around the position, make radio calls requesting backup. Make them believe we're hunkered down for a long siege while I get the wounded to safety." Colonel Thompson stirred, trying to sit up. What's happening?" he asked, his words still badly slurred. "Sir, we're working on getting you out of here," Sarah said gently, checking his pupils again. The concussion symptoms were definitely worsening. "I need you to trust me and stay calm." I can still fight," Thompson insisted, though he could barely focus his eyes. "No, sir. Right now, your job is to let me take care of you." Sarah turned to Williams. "We need to make this decision now. His condition is deteriorating, and Rodriguez needs blood transfusions within hours." Williams made his choice with a decisiveness that had made him a good sergeant. "Do it. Johnson, Patterson, Murphy, you're with me. We'll keep up suppressing fire and make them think we're preparing for a breakout attempt. Doc, you get our people to safety." Sarah began organizing her evacuation plan with military precision. Colonel Thompson would go first. His head injury made him the most critical case. Rodriguez would be second due to his blood loss. Then, the others in order of severity. "Sir, I'm going to carry you up that ravine," Sarah explained to Colonel Thompson. "It's going to be uncomfortable, but I need you to stay as still as possible." "This is insane," Thompson mumbled, but his protest lacked conviction. Even in his confused state, he seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. Sarah positioned herself carefully and lifted the colonel onto her shoulders in a fireman's carry. At 195 pounds, he was significantly heavier than anything she had lifted in training, but adrenaline and determination gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. The first few steps toward the ravine nearly convinced her the plan was impossible. Colonel Thompson's weight pressed down on her shoulders like a crushing burden, and the rocky ground made each step treacherous. But Sarah gritted her teeth and kept moving, driven by the knowledge that lives depended on her success. The ravine was even steeper than it had appeared from distance. Loose rocks and crumbling handholds made the climb dangerous under the best circumstances. Carrying an unconscious soldier made it seem nearly impossible. But Sarah had spent years building up her strength and endurance, and she called upon every ounce of that training now. Halfway up the ravine, her legs began trembling from exhaustion. The colonel had lost consciousness again, making him dead weight on her shoulders. Sweat poured down her face despite the cool mountain air, and her breathing came in ragged gasps. But she could hear the sounds of the firefight behind her, reminding her that Williams and the others were risking their lives to give her this opportunity. "Come on, Sarah," she whispered to herself. One step at a time. The climb that should have taken 20 minutes stretched to nearly 45. By the time Sarah reached the top of the ridge, her legs were shaking uncontrollably, and she could barely stand. But she had done it. Colonel Thompson was safely away from the ambush site. Sarah quickly assessed the colonel's condition. His pulse was still weak, but he was breathing steadily. More importantly, she was now in a position to radio for medical evacuation without the enemy being able to interfere. "Alpha Base, this is Field Medic Martinez," she called in her radio. "I have critical casualties requiring immediate medical evacuation. Grid reference Sierra 749. Requesting helicopter extraction at earliest possible time." "Copy, Martinez. Medical helicopters are inbound. Estimated arrival 20 minutes. Can you mark the landing zone?" "Affirmative. Yellow smoke in 20 minutes. Sarah allowed herself one moment of relief before beginning the grueling trek back down the ravine. The second trip, carrying Rodriguez, was even more difficult. The wounded soldier was unconscious from blood loss, and his limp body was harder to manage than the colonel's had been. Twice during the climb, Sarah nearly lost her footing on loose rocks, which would have meant a potentially fatal fall for both of them. But she persevered, driven by the knowledge that each soldier she saved was someone's son, brother, or father. Rodriguez had shown her pictures of his newborn daughter just that morning. That baby girl deserved to grow up with her father, and Sarah was determined to make that happen. By the time the medical helicopters arrived, Sarah had successfully evacuated both critical casualties. She watched with satisfaction as the flight medics took over their care, knowing that Colonel Thompson and Rodriguez now had a real chance of survival. "Martinez, what's your status?" came Williams' voice over the radio. "2 critical casualties evacuated successfully," Sarah replied. "I'm coming back for the others." "Negative. The enemy has figured out what we're doing. They're trying to flank our position. We need you to stay with the helicopters and coordinate additional medical evacuation for the rest of the wounded." Sarah's heart sank. She had hoped to evacuate all the wounded soldiers personally, but the tactical situation was evolving. Still, she had saved the 2 most critical cases, and that achievement filled her with fierce satisfaction. From her position on the ridge, Sarah could see the full scope of the battle below. Williams and his reduced force were putting up a heroic defense, but they were clearly outnumbered. The enemy fighters had realized that their ambush was failing and were now attempting to overrun the convoy's position through sheer numbers. "Alpha Base, this is Martinez," she radioed again. I have 6 additional wounded soldiers requiring evacuation, but the landing zone is under direct fire. We need immediate air support to clear the area. Copy, Martinez. Close air support is inbound. Mark enemy positions with red smoke. Sarah pulled smoke grenades from her pack and began marking enemy positions she could see from her elevated vantage point. Within minutes, the distinctive sound of jet engines filled the air as attack aircraft arrived to support the beleaguered convoy. The air strikes were devastatingly effective. Enemy positions that had seemed impregnable just minutes earlier disappeared in clouds of smoke and flame. The fighters who had pinned down the convoy for hours were suddenly the ones seeking cover. All enemy positions neutralized, came the voice of the lead pilot. Ground units are clear to move. Williams' voice crackled over the radio with obvious relief. Outstanding work, document. You saved our asses today. But Sarah wasn't finished yet. As additional medical helicopters arrived to evacuate the remaining wounded soldiers, she coordinated their care with the same precision she had shown during the emergency surgeries. Each soldier received the exact treatment they needed for their specific injuries. Private Miller's shoulder wound was stabilized for surgery. Specialist Garcia's concussion was assessed and monitored. Corporal Washington's burns were treated with specialized dressings. By the time the last helicopter departed, all 8 wounded soldiers were receiving the medical care they needed to survive. Standing alone on the ridge as the sun began to set, Sarah felt the weight of the day's events settling upon her. She had been tested in ways she never could have imagined, and somehow she had found the strength to meet every challenge. But she also knew that the day's events would change her forever. Looking down at the valley where the ambush had occurred, Sarah could see Williams and the other soldiers beginning to police the area and prepare for extraction. They had survived one of the worst days any of them would ever experience, but they had survived it together. Sarah's radio crackled with an incoming message. Martinez, this is Alpha Base. Outstanding work today. Be advised that Colonel Thompson is in stable condition and asking for you personally. Rodriguez is in surgery, but expected to make a full recovery. For the first time all day, Sarah allowed herself to smile. She had done what she had set out to do. She had saved lives when everything seemed hopeless. But more than that, she had proven to herself and to everyone around her that she was far more than just another field medic. She was a soldier. 3 weeks later, Sarah Martinez stood in the medical ward of the base hospital, checking on her patients one final time before returning to duty. The sterile smell of antiseptic and the gentle hum of monitoring equipment had become familiar companions during her daily visits to the recovering soldiers. Colonel Thompson was awake and alert, though he still showed some effect from his traumatic brain injury. His memory of the ambush remained spotty, but his cognitive functions were steadily improving. When he saw Sarah approaching his bedside, his face lit up with recognition. "There's my guardian angel," he said warmly, his speech now clear and strong. "I've been waiting for you to stop by. How are you feeling today, sir?" Sarah asked, automatically checking the monitors beside his bed. "Better every day, thanks to you." Thompson's expression grew serious. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. I've been thinking about what happened out there, piecing together the reports and witness statements. What you did, carry me 2 miles through hostile territory while under fire, that was extraordinary." Sarah felt uncomfortable with the praise. "I was just doing my job, sir." "No, you were doing far more than your job. You made split-second decisions that saved 8 soldiers' lives, including mine. You took command of medical crisis while bullets were flying around your head. That's not training, Sarah. That's character." Before Sarah could respond, a wheelchair rolled into the room, carrying Rodriguez, who was recovering from his emergency surgery. His leg was still heavily bandaged, but his color had returned to normal, and his smile was infectious. "Doc, perfect timing," Rodriguez called out. "I wanted to show you something." He pulled out his phone and displayed a photo of himself holding his infant daughter. Maria's first word wasn't mama or dada, it was Doc. "I swear she knows who saved her daddy's life." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. "How's the physical therapy going?" Doctors say I'll make a full recovery. Might have a slight limp, but I'll be able to walk my daughter down the aisle someday, thanks to you." Rodriguez's voice was thick with emotion. "I can never repay what you did for me." "You don't need to repay anything," Sarah replied. "Just be the best father you can be." As Rodriguez wheeled away, Colonel Thompson studied Sarah's face carefully. "You saved all of us that day, but you haven't saved yourself, have you?" Sarah looked at him in confusion. "What do you mean, sir? You're still carrying the weight of what happened. I can see it in your eyes. You did everything perfectly, Sarah, but you're torturing yourself about something." Sarah hesitated before answering. "I keep thinking about what could have gone wrong. What if I hadn't been strong enough to carry you up that ravine? What if Rodriguez had bled out during the climb? What if the helicopters had been delayed?" "But none of those things happened," Thompson said firmly. "You made the right decisions under impossible circumstances. You saved lives that would have been lost without your intervention. You need to give yourself credit for that." "It doesn't feel like enough," Sarah admitted. "I'm supposed to protect everyone, and I couldn't prevent the ambush from happening in the first place." Colonel Thompson's expression softened with understanding. "Sarah, you can't prevent every tragedy. What you can do is respond with courage and skill when tragedy strikes. And that's exactly what you did." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant Williams, who was carrying a thick folder of documents. His arm was in a sling from a minor wound he had received during the firefight, but otherwise, he appeared fully recovered. "Martinez, perfect timing," Williams said with a grin. "I've got some paperwork that might interest you." "What kind of paperwork?" Williams opened the folder and pulled out an official document with military seals and signatures. "Your promotion orders." "Congratulations, Sergeant Martinez." Sarah stared at the document in disbelief. "Promotion? I don't understand." "Field promotion, confirmed by headquarters," Colonel Thompson explained. "Based on your actions during the ambush, you've been promoted to sergeant and recommended for the Silver Star Medal." "The Silver Star?" Sarah felt dizzy. "Sir, I don't deserve that. I was just doing what any medic would do." "That's where you're wrong," Williams interjected. "I've talked to every soldier who was there that day. Not one of them thinks what you did was routine. You didn't just treat wounded soldiers. You took command of an impossible situation and turned it into a rescue operation." Sarah thought about Private Johnson, who had initially doubted her capabilities. Just yesterday, he had stopped by her quarters to personally thank her for saving his friends' lives. The skepticism in his eyes had been replaced by genuine respect and admiration. "There's something else," Colonel Thompson said, pulling out another document. "You've been selected for advanced medical training. Special Operations Combat Medic course. If you accept, you'll be trained to work with elite units in the most challenging environments." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sudden turn her career was taking. Just a month ago, she had been struggling to prove herself worthy of basic respect. Now she was being offered opportunities she had never dreamed possible. "I need to think about this," she said quietly. "Of course," Thompson replied. "But, Sarah, I want you to know something. In 30 years of military service, I've never seen anyone demonstrate the kind of courage and competence you showed that day. The Army needs more soldiers like you." That evening, Sarah found herself walking the perimeter of the base, thinking about everything that had happened. The night air was cool and clear, filled with the distant sounds of military operations continuing around the clock. She paused at a memorial wall where the names of fallen soldiers were engraved in black granite. Each name represented someone's son, daughter, parent, or spouse. Someone who had served with the same dedication she was trying to live up to. "Pretty sobering, isn't it?" came a voice behind her. Sarah turned to see Rodriguez approaching on crutches, moving slowly but steadily. "Rodriguez, you should be resting." Couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about everything. He joined her in front of the memorial wall. "You know what I realized today? My name almost went on this wall. If it wasn't for you, Maria would have grown up without a father." "Don't think about that," Sarah said softly. "I have to think about it," Rodriguez replied, "because it helps me understand what courage really means. It's not about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done despite being afraid." Sarah considered his words. "I was terrified that entire day. Every time I picked up one of you wounded soldiers, I was sure I wouldn't be strong enough to make the climb. But You did it anyway. That's what makes you a hero. I don't feel like a hero. Rodriguez laughed gently. Heroes never do. They just feel like people who did what had to be done. As they stood together in comfortable silence, Sarah began to understand something important about herself. She had spent so much time trying to prove she belonged in the army that she had lost sight of why she had joined in the first place. It wasn't about proving herself to skeptical soldiers or earning promotions or medals. It was about being there when people needed help the most. Rodriguez, she said suddenly, what made you decide to trust me that day? When you were bleeding out, you could have died from shock and fear alone. But you stayed calm and let me work. Easy answer, Rodriguez replied. I looked into your eyes and saw someone who knew exactly what she was doing. You had this absolute confidence that you were going to fix me, and somehow that confidence transferred to me. Sarah thought about that moment, kneeling in the dust with bullets flying overhead, working to repair a severed artery with basic field medical equipment. She remembered feeling that strange sense of clarity, as if all her training and preparation had been leading to that exact moment. I need to accept that special operations training, she said suddenly. Absolutely you do, Rodriguez agreed. The Army needs medics who can handle impossible situations. And after what you did for us, I think you're ready for anything they can throw at you. The next morning, Sarah reported to Colonel Thompson's temporary office to formally accept her promotion and the advanced training opportunity. She found him reviewing mission reports, though he looked up with a smile when she entered. I've made my decision, sir, Sarah announced. I accept the promotion and the special operations training. Outstanding, Thompson replied. I think you're making the right choice. But I'm curious, what convinced you? Sarah thought carefully before answering. I realized that I joined the Army to help people, not to prove myself to anyone. The soldiers I saved that day didn't care whether I was experienced or inexperienced, male or female, tall or short. They just needed someone who could do the job when it mattered most. And you did the job magnificently. I want to keep doing the job, sir, wherever the Army needs me most. Colonel Thompson stood and extended his hand. Sergeant Martinez, it's been an honor serving with you. I have no doubt that you'll continue to make the Army proud. As Sarah shook his hand, she reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. She was no longer the uncertain medic trying to prove herself worthy of respect. She had become someone her fellow soldiers could count on in the worst possible circumstances. But more than that, she had discovered something about herself that she hadn't known existed. Under pressure, when everything seemed hopeless, she had found reserves of strength, courage, and determination that surprised even her. Walking out of Colonel Thompson's office with her new sergeant stripes and orders for advanced training, Sarah felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. She had learned that being nothing more than a field medic was actually everything the Army needed her to be. She was a soldier, a healer, and a leader. And she was just getting started. 6 months later, Sergeant Sarah Martinez graduated at the top of her Special Operations Combat Medic class. Her instructors noted her exceptional ability to remain calm under pressure and her innovative approaches to field medicine. But Sarah knew the real test of her training would come when she found herself responsible for saving lives in impossible circumstances. She was ready for that test because she had learned that heroes aren't born. They're forged in the moments when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things. And Sarah Martinez had chosen to be extraordinary when it mattered most. The story of the field medic who carried a colonel 2 miles through hostile territory became legend within military medical circles. But for Sarah, it was simply the beginning of a career dedicated to ensuring that no soldier would be left behind on her watch. She had found her calling, and her calling had made her into exactly the kind of soldier the Army needed most.